The morning Kevin disappeared, his mother ironed his favorite red plaid shirt while sunlight filtered through kitchen curtains that still smelled faintly of fabric softener. It was Tuesday, October 17th, 1989, and the radio played something forgettable, while Linda Fisher pressed careful creases into the collar. Kevin had asked to wear that shirt specifically. He'd gotten a compliment on it the week before from a girl in his social studies class. He was 12 years old, standing at that awkward threshold between childhood and something else entirely, his voice cracking when he got excited about things. Linda remembers folding the shirt and placing it on the banister, remembers Kevin's blue sneakers with the white stripe sitting by the front door, laces still tied from the previous day. She remembers the weight of normalcy, the beautiful ignorance of not knowing that within 6 hours, every object in that house would become evidence, every ordinary moment transformed into the last time. She remembers thinking how the sneakers looked almost new despite Kevin wearing them every day for 3 months, how he'd begged for them at the mall, pointing through the window at that specific pair with the distinctive white stripe along the sole. Kevin left for Riverside Middle School at 7:43 that morning. Linda watched from the porch as he walked down Maple Street with his backpack slung over one shoulder, the red plaid visible for 3 blocks until he turned the corner toward the bus stop. The October air carried the smell of burning leaves from someone's yard, 2 streets over. Everything felt exactly as it should. A neighbor watering petunias waved. A dog barked lazily from behind a fence. The normalcy of it all would haunt Linda for years. How could the world look so ordinary in the moments before it shattered completely? But Kevin Fischer never arrived at school that day. His seat in first period remained empty. His locker stayed closed. And for 29 years, no one knew why. The absence seemed impossible at first, as if Kevin had simply slipped between the cracks of reality, as if a 12-year-old boy could evaporate like morning fog under an October sun. Before we go further into what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you're drawn to stories about people who vanish and the families who never stop searching, subscribe to this channel. We handle these cases with the care they deserve. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Knowing this community spans the globe makes these stories feel less isolating for the families still waiting. The call came to Linda's workplace at 2:17 that afternoon. The school attendance office wanted to confirm Kevin's absence. Linda felt her stomach drop in that particular way that parents recognize instantly, the body understanding before the mind catches up. She told her supervisor she needed to leave immediately, drove home with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, expecting to find him sick in bed, having overslept somehow. But his bed was made with the same precision he'd learned from years of Linda's gentle insistence. The red plaid shirt hung in his closet, still carrying the faint smell of laundry detergent. The blue sneakers with the white stripe were gone. By 4 o'clock, Linda had called every friend whose number she had. By 5, she'd driven the route to school twice, scanning ditches and alleyways with growing panic tightening around her chest. At 6:15, when her husband Tom arrived home from the construction site, still wearing sawdust on his jeans, she was on the phone with the Riverside Police Department. And the word missing had entered their vocabulary in a way it would never leave. Tom stood in the doorway of Kevin's room, staring at the made bed, the organized desk, the posters of science fiction movies on the walls, trying to find some clue in the ordinary arrangement of his son's life. Officer Patricia Mendez arrived within the hour. She was methodical and kind, asking questions that felt invasive but necessary. Had Kevin seemed upset lately? Any problems at school? Any conflicts with other kids? Had there been any strangers in the neighborhood, any unusual vehicles? Linda and Tom answered everything, their voices growing smaller as the questions accumulated. No. Kevin was a normal kid, quiet sometimes, funny other times. He liked science fiction novels and hated lima beans and wanted to learn guitar someday. He'd asked for lessons for Christmas. Tom had been planning to surprise him with a used acoustic he'd seen at a pawn shop downtown. Patricia took notes in a spiral pad, writing down the description: white male, 12 years old, 5'3", approximately 95 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, last seen wearing jeans, a grey hoodie, and blue sneakers with white stripes. She radioed it in before she left, upgrading it to immediate priority when she learned Kevin had now been missing for over 8 hours. In her 8 years on the force, Patricia had worked 4 missing child cases. 3 had ended with kids found at friends' houses or relatives' homes within 24 hours. 1 had never been solved. She hoped Kevin would be in the first category, but something about the parents' certainty that this wasn't normal made her uneasy. The search began that night under portable floodlights that turned the neighborhood into something from a film set. Neighbors emerged from houses up and down Maple Street, some still in work clothes, others in sweatpants and slippers. They formed lines and walked through backyards, checked sheds and garages, called Kevin's name until their voices went hoarse. Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down brought thermoses of coffee. Mr. Rodriguez, who worked nights at the hospital, cancelled his shift to help search. The community response was immediate and total, fueled by the terrifying awareness that this could happen to anyone's child. Search dogs arrived around midnight, German shepherds that pulled handlers through the darkness, noses to the ground, following scent trails that led nowhere conclusive. The dogs picked up Kevin's scent along his usual route to the bus stop, following it down Maple Street with purpose, then lost it completely at the intersection of Maple and 14th Street. Just gone, as if he'd evaporated into October air. The K9 handler, a woman named Sarah who'd worked search and rescue for 15 years, explained to Tom and Linda that scent can be interrupted by vehicles, that if someone had picked Kevin up, the trail would end exactly like this. That's where the first theory took root. Someone had picked him up. A car, a van, something quick and deliberate. The alternative was that Kevin had walked away deliberately, but nothing in his life suggested that kind of planning or desperation. By dawn on October 18th, Kevin's face was on flyers. Tom and Linda spent that entire day at a copy shop, feeding coins into machines, watching their son's school photo multiply into hundreds of desperate appeals. "Have you seen this boy?" The photo showed Kevin with a slight smile, his hair a bit too long over his ears, wearing a striped collar shirt. He looked exactly like what he was, a kid who probably daydreamed during math class and collected baseball cards. Linda stared at the photo until it stopped looking like her son and became just an arrangement of pixels and ink, then forced herself to look away before the disconnect became permanent. The distribution effort expanded rapidly. Flyers went up on telephone poles, in gas station windows, at the grocery store entrance, the library, the post office. Volunteers formed teams and canvassed a 5-mile radius, then 10, then 20. Local television stations ran the story on evening news broadcasts. The National Center for Missing Children added Kevin to their database, assigning his case a number that would follow him through decades of searches. For those first few weeks, it felt like momentum, like all this activity would surely yield results. The phone rang constantly with tips and sightings, each one launching a new cycle of hope and investigation. Then came the first false hope. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a truck driver called from a rest stop in Nebraska, certain he'd seen Kevin. The description matched: brown hair, small for his age, wearing sneakers with white stripes. The boy had been at the rest stop with an older woman, seemed quiet, hadn't made eye contact. Police drove out immediately, sirens cutting through the November cold, carrying with them Linda's desperate prayers. The boy turned out to be a 10-year-old traveling with his grandmother, annoyed by the commotion and frightened by the police attention. Linda's heart, which had leapt with desperate optimism, crashed back down. She began to understand that hope could be its own form of torture, that every phone call would bring this same cycle of adrenaline and devastation until the day Kevin was actually found. The investigation widened. Detectives combed through Kevin's school records, interviewed his teachers and classmates, analyzed his few friendships for signs of trouble. They found nothing alarming. Kevin was quiet but not withdrawn, earned B's and C's, had never been in serious trouble. He'd been in the library the day before he vanished, checking out a Michael Crichton novel. The librarian remembered because Kevin had asked if it was scary, and she told him it was more scientific than frightening, which seemed to please him. That small interaction became precious to Linda later, proof that Kevin had been planning for a future, thinking about what he'd read that evening, existing in the world with normal 12-year-old concerns. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from every business within 2 miles of Kevin's route to school. The quality was poor. This was 1989, and most security cameras recorded on VHS tapes that were reused weekly. They found footage of Kevin passing a convenience store at 7:47, walking with purpose, backpack visible. Then nothing. Whatever happened occurred in the 15-minute window between that footage and the time Kevin should have arrived at his bus stop. Detectives interviewed drivers who regularly traveled that route in the mornings, showed Kevin's photo to hundreds of people who might have been on Maple Street that Tuesday. No one remembered seeing anything unusual. They investigated family members, as protocol demanded. Tom's brother had a record for drunk driving, but lived 3 states away and had been at work the morning Kevin disappeared. Linda's ex-boyfriend from before her marriage was questioned and cleared. They looked at registered sex offenders in a 20-mile radius, brought several in for questioning, verified alibis. They examined Kevin's computer, an old Commodore 64 he used mainly for games, and found nothing concerning. There were no secret chat logs, no suspicious contacts, no indication Kevin had been communicating with anyone unusual. He was simply a normal kid who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Months became a year. The Fischers' home transformed into a kind of museum to absence. Kevin's room stayed exactly as he'd left it. Posters on the walls, homework still in his backpack, the red plaid shirt hanging in the closet like a ghost. Linda couldn't bring herself to touch anything. She'd go in sometimes just to sit on his bed, pressing her face into his pillow even after it stopped smelling like him, trying to remember the sound of his voice before it faded completely from memory. Tom built a small table in the living room dedicated to the search effort, covered with maps and phone lists and copies of police reports. The maps had pins marking every sighting, every lead, creating a constellation of false hopes across the western United States. They celebrated Kevin's 13th birthday by releasing 13 balloons at the park where he used to play. Other families whose children had gone missing came to stand with them, a grim fellowship none of them had wanted to join. Linda met other mothers who understood the specific hell of not knowing, of existing in limbo between hope and grief, unable to move forward or back. They became a support network, calling each other during dark moments, sharing information about new investigative techniques, advocacy strategies, ways to keep cases active when police departments wanted to shift resources to newer emergencies. The financial toll came gradually. Linda reduced her hours at the insurance office to manage the search effort, to be available for phone calls from investigators, to coordinate volunteer searches and media appearances. Tom missed days of work for police interviews and false sightings that required him to drive across state lines to identify boys who weren't Kevin. They spent thousands on private investigators who turned up nothing new, on psychics who claimed to sense Kevin near water or in a basement or traveling west. Each false lead carved away another piece of their savings and their faith in human decency. The psychics were the worst. People willing to exploit desperate parents, to conjure vague images and charge money for lies dressed up as spiritual insight. Marriages often fracture under this kind of strain. Linda and Tom's relationship became functional rather than intimate, organized around the single purpose of finding their son. They stopped celebrating anniversaries. They stopped planning for any future beyond the next search grid, the next age progression photo, the next television appeal. Conversations became transactional. Did you call the detective back? Did you update the website? Did you see the news story about the case in Ohio that sounds similar? They slept in the same bed, but existed in separate universes of grief, each processing the loss differently, unable to bridge the gap that trauma had opened between them. Other families stopped inviting them to gatherings because they didn't know what to say anymore. People crossed the street to avoid conversations that might lead to the question, "Any news about Kevin?" The isolation was complete. They became defined entirely by their tragedy, by the missing child who'd once been a real boy with preferences and habits and a future. Linda sometimes forgot what she'd been like before October 17th, 1989. That version of herself seemed like a different person entirely, someone naive and unprepared for how quickly everything could vanish. The investigators working Kevin's case changed over time. Patricia Mendez stayed on it longer than most, visiting the Fischers quarterly even when there were no new developments, maintaining the human connection that prevented the case from becoming just another file number. But eventually she transferred to another department, burned out from years of working cases that rarely resolved happily. New detectives would inherit the file, review everything again, make the same inquiries that had already been made. Tom learned to brief them efficiently, walking them through the timeline, the evidence, the dead ends, watching their faces as they realized there was nothing obvious left to investigate. The case went cold, not because anyone gave up, but because there was simply nowhere left to look. Behind the scenes, though, certain procedures continued. Kevin's information remained in the National Crime Information Center database, a digital ghost waiting for a match. His DNA profile, extracted from a baby tooth Linda had saved in a jewelry box, unable to throw away these small relics of childhood, was entered into the combined DNA index system in 1994, when the technology became available. The process was straightforward. Technicians extracted genetic material from the tooth's pulp, created a profile of markers that were uniquely Kevin's, and uploaded it to a database where it would sit waiting for any match against unidentified remains or persons found without identification. His school photo was age progressed every 5 years by forensic artists who specialized in predicting how time might alter bone structure and facial proportions, how baby fat would melt away to reveal adult features, how hair might recede or gray. Linda kept every age progression image, storing them in a binder that grew thicker with each passing 5 years. Kevin at 17, Kevin at 22, Kevin at 27. Each image was a reminder of time stolen, of milestones missed. She tried to imagine what he'd sound like with an adult voice, how tall he'd be, whether he'd look more like Tom or more like her. The exercise was torture, but she couldn't stop herself from doing it, from trying to maintain some connection to the son who'd aged without her. The world moved on, in the way it always does. Riverside grew. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children who'd been toddlers when Kevin disappeared, graduated high school, went to college, got married. The flyers faded in windows and were eventually taken down or covered by other notices. New missing children cases dominated the news cycle, each one a reminder that the tragedy wasn't unique, that families were being destroyed by these disappearances every day. But Linda and Tom Fischer remained frozen in October 1989, their lives measured by the absence of their son, by the calendar that marked not years, but the accumulation of days without answers. Then in August 2018, a caseworker in Portland, Oregon, named Angela Chen, was processing intake paperwork for a new client at a transitional housing facility. The man was 41 years old, recently released from a psychiatric hospital after a breakdown, and needed temporary assistance while stabilizing. His story was complicated. He'd been living under an assumed identity for years, supporting himself through odd jobs, but had no official documentation, no social security number that could be verified, no birth certificate. This wasn't unusual in Angela's line of work. She'd processed homeless veterans with lost paperwork, people fleeing domestic violence who'd changed their names informally, immigrants without proper documentation. But something about this case felt different. During the assessment, something about his mannerisms caught Angela's attention. He was articulate, but seemed to carry a profound disconnection from his own history, speaking about his past in vague terms that suggested gaps rather than privacy. When she asked about his childhood, he became agitated, then suddenly very calm, and said something that made her stop writing. His hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes had the distant look of someone accessing memories that hurt to touch. "I remember everything now," he said, "but for a long time I didn't know who I was." Angela had worked with trafficking survivors, people who'd been held in cults, individuals who'd fled abusive situations and constructed new identities out of necessity. She knew how to listen without pushing, how to create space for difficult truths. Over the next hour, the man explained that he'd spent most of his adult life believing his name was Marcus Webb, that he'd grown up in foster care, that his early memories were vague and disconnected. But recently, triggered by something as simple as seeing a photograph of a middle school in a magazine while waiting in a doctor's office, fragments had started returning. The image had shown students outside a brick building in autumn, leaves on the ground, and something about it had cracked open a door in his mind that had been sealed for decades. He remembered a house with yellow siding, a mother who sang while cooking, usually off-key but with enthusiasm, a father with paint-stained hands who worked construction and came home smelling like sawdust and sweat. October leaves crunching underfoot. Blue sneakers with a white stripe that he'd loved, that had felt like the coolest thing he'd ever owned, a bus stop where he'd wait with other kids, and then nothing, a gap of weeks or months where memory simply ceased, and then being somewhere else entirely, being told he was someone else, being convinced through repetition and isolation that his previous life had never existed, that the memories were fantasies or dreams, not real things that had actually happened. Angela listened with the trained attention of someone who'd heard impossible stories before, who knew that truth was often stranger and more painful than fiction. Then she did what any good caseworker does when confronted with the possibility of something extraordinary. She took detailed notes, documenting everything he said with precise language that could be used for official purposes later. And then she contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, explaining that she might have a man in his 40s who was describing childhood memories consistent with a long-term missing child. She provided the details he'd shared: Riverside, a middle school, autumn, the late 1980s, parents named Tom and Linda, blue sneakers with distinctive white stripes. The response came back within 48 hours. The details aligned with a case from 1989. Kevin Fischer, missing from Riverside since October 17th of that year. The case had remained open for 29 years, DNA sample on file, family still active in searches. Could the man provide any identifying information? Scars, birthmarks, anything that could be verified against medical records? Did he remember his exact birth date? Any specific details about his home, his school, his life before? The man who called himself Marcus Webb closed his eyes and recited March 3rd, 1977. He described a small scar on his left knee from falling off his bike when he was 9. How the pavement had torn the skin, and his mother had cleaned it with hydrogen peroxide that stung so badly he'd cried. He mentioned that his left front tooth was slightly crooked, never corrected with braces, because his parents couldn't afford it, and he'd been self-conscious about it in school photos. He remembered his bedroom had been painted light blue, that there'd been a poster of the solar system on the ceiling that he'd stare at before falling asleep. He remembered his father teaching him to tie his shoes using a story about rabbit ears. The medical records on file for Kevin Fischer confirmed the scar and the crooked tooth. The bedroom details matched what investigators had documented in 1989. But memories could be contaminated, influenced by media coverage, by wishful thinking. The only way to be certain was genetic testing. A DNA test was expedited. The process itself is straightforward but precise. A simple cheek swab, cells collected with a sterile applicator and sent to a lab where technicians extract DNA and compare it against the sample from Kevin's baby tooth that had been waiting in the system for 29 years. Every person carries a unique genetic signature composed of markers inherited from both parents in combinations that are statistically impossible to replicate by chance. Familial matches show unmistakable patterns across multiple loci. There's no room for coincidence at that level of biological specificity. The lab ran the sample twice to be certain, checking 13 different genetic markers. The results came back positive with a probability exceeding 99%. The man in Portland was Kevin Fischer. The notification to Linda and Tom came through official channels, a call from the Riverside Police Department asking them to come to the station for an update on their son's case. They'd received such calls before over the years, usually about remains being identified in other states, after hikers found bones in remote areas, usually ending in the crushing relief of knowing it wasn't Kevin, but the horror of knowing some other family was receiving devastating news. Tom and Linda held hands in the car on the drive to the station, preparing themselves for whatever came next, armor built from 29 years of disappointment. This time, Detective James Morrison met them in a private conference room. He was young, probably not even born when Kevin disappeared, assigned to cold cases just 6 months earlier. He asked them to sit down, and Linda knew from his face that something fundamental was about to shift. There was something in his expression, not grief, which she'd seen in other officers' faces when they delivered bad news, but something else. Disbelief, maybe, or wonder. "We've found Kevin," Morrison said. The words seemed impossible, arranged in an order that didn't make sense after 29 years. He's alive. He's in Oregon. The next minutes unfolded in a kind of suspended reality where time seemed to both stop and accelerate simultaneously. Alive. Oregon. DNA match. Certain. Living under another name. No memory for most of those years. Wanting to come home. To understand what happened. The information came in fragments because that's all Linda and Tom could process. Their son, who had been 12, was now 41. He'd lived an entire adult life they knew nothing about. There'd been birthdays they hadn't celebrated, illnesses they hadn't nursed, achievements they hadn't witnessed, heartbreaks they hadn't soothed. 29 years of moments that had occurred without them, a parallel existence they'd never get to know fully. Morrison explained what they knew so far about Kevin's recovery of memory, about the psychiatric hospitalization, about the caseworker who'd made the connection. He explained that Kevin was stable but fragile, that reunification would need to be handled carefully, that trauma specialists were already involved. Linda barely heard the details. Her mind was stuck on one impossible fact. Her son was alive. The boy she'd mourned every day for nearly 3 decades was breathing, thinking, existing somewhere in the world. The grief she'd carried, so heavy it had become part of her identity, suddenly had nowhere to go. Tom cried for the first time since the initial weeks of Kevin's disappearance. He'd held it together for 29 years, had channeled everything into the search effort, into supporting Linda, into maintaining some semblance of function. But now, sitting in the conference room of the Riverside Police Department on an August afternoon in 2018, he wept like a child. Linda held him, and they sat there together while Detective Morrison quietly left the room to give them privacy, to let them process the impossible news that their son had returned from a place beyond death, from the realm of the vanished. The logistics of reunion were handled carefully. Trauma specialists were brought in to prepare everyone. Psychologists who specialized in cases of recovered memory and long-term separation. Kevin, who still struggled to think of himself by that name after decades as Marcus Webb, needed time to stabilize and adjust to the implications of his recovered identity, to integrate 29 years of false history with the real past that was emerging from behind the walls his mind had built. Linda and Tom needed to understand that the child they'd lost was now a middle-aged man, shaped by experiences they couldn't imagine. That reunion wouldn't mean everything suddenly made sense or became okay. That there would be complications and boundaries and grief mixed into the joy. The therapists explained concepts like dissociative amnesia, how the mind sometimes protects itself from unbearable trauma by severing access to memories, how children especially can be manipulated into accepting false narratives when isolated from contradictory information. They explained that Kevin's memories might never fully return, that there could be permanent gaps, that the process of reintegration would be long and non-linear. They warned about expectations, about the fantasy of reunion versus the reality of trauma recovery. They met in a neutral location, a family services center in Portland, with counselors present and protocols in place. Linda brought the blue sneakers she'd saved, the ones with the white stripe, preserved all these years in a plastic bag in Kevin's closet, alongside the red plaid shirt and other relics of his childhood. It seemed important to have something tangible, something that connected past to present, physical proof that the boy who'd worn those shoes had been real. The man who entered the room looked nothing like the age-progressed photos the forensic artists had created. He was taller than they'd imagined, thin in a way that suggested years of inadequate nutrition, with lines around his eyes and grey threading through his brown hair. He moved carefully, as if unsure of the space his body occupied, and his eyes scanned the room in a way that suggested hypervigilance born from trauma. But when he smiled, nervous, tentative, uncertain, Linda saw her son. The same slightly crooked front tooth, the same way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the same small birthmark on his neck that she'd kissed 1,000 times when he was small. They didn't embrace immediately. There was too much strangeness, too much time, too many years of separate existence compressed into this single moment. They sat across from each other at a table, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The counselor who'd brought Kevin in waited patiently, letting them navigate the impossibility of what was happening. Finally, Kevin spoke first, his voice deeper than Tom and Linda had imagined, carrying traces of accents from places they'd never been. "I don't know how much I can explain," he said, "but I remember you. I remember the house. I remember being happy." His hands rested on the table, and Linda noticed they trembled slightly. "I remember you singing in the kitchen, off-key but loud." He looked at Linda, and his eyes filled with tears. "I remember Dad teaching me to tie my shoes with the rabbit ear story. I remember feeling safe." The story that emerged over the following weeks, through therapy sessions and police interviews and long conversations in monitored settings, was both simpler and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Kevin had been taken that October morning by a woman named Diane Pritchard, someone who'd been watching him for weeks, learning his routine, studying his patterns. She'd been suffering from a delusional disorder, convinced that she was meant to be a mother, that the universe was sending her a child. She'd seen Kevin at the bus stop, decided he was the one, and planned the abduction with meticulous attention to detail. She'd approached him that morning, at the bus stop, told him his mother had been in an accident at her work, that she was in the hospital, that she'd been sent to bring him there immediately. 12-year-old Kevin, frightened and trusting of an adult who seemed official and certain and used his mother's name, had gotten into her car without hesitation. By the time he realized something was wrong, they were already on the highway heading east, and Diane had locked the doors. Diane had taken him to a house 3 states away, a rental property in a rural area where neighbors were sparse and questions were rare. She and her partner Roger kept him in isolation for the first months, telling him his parents hadn't wanted him, that he'd been abandoned, that they were his family now. They showed him forged documents, told him his memories were wrong, that he'd always been Marcus Webb, that his previous life had been a fantasy he'd made up. They homeschooled him with curriculum that reinforced the false identity, kept him away from other children who might question the story, and over time, through a combination of manipulation and Kevin's own young mind protecting itself from unbearable trauma, he'd begun to believe the story they told. The human mind, especially a child's mind, is remarkably adaptable when survival depends on it. Kevin's acceptance of the false identity wasn't weakness or gullibility. It was the only way his 12-year-old psyche could process the impossible situation he'd been trapped in. Believing he was Marcus Webb, that Tom and Linda had never existed, that his memories of happiness were just dreams, was less painful than holding on to a truth that offered no escape. By the time Kevin was 16, he'd been conditioned so thoroughly that he didn't question his identity as Marcus Webb. When Diane and Roger's relationship fell apart and they separated, Roger moving out after a violent argument that Kevin had witnessed, Kevin was shuffled into the foster system with forged paperwork that Diane had prepared years earlier in case something went wrong. The documents showed Marcus Webb as her nephew, placed in her care after his parents' deaths, now needing state assistance after she could no longer care for him due to financial hardship. No one looked closely enough at the discrepancies. Social workers, overwhelmed with genuine cases, accepted the paperwork at face value. He aged out of foster care at 18, legally an adult, but completely unprepared for independent life. He worked minimum-wage jobs, dishwashing, warehouse labor, retail positions that asked few questions, lived in cheap apartments and sometimes his car, always carrying a sense that something was wrong but unable to articulate what. He tried to build a normal life, but found himself unable to maintain relationships, unable to trust people, plagued by anxiety and depression he couldn't explain. He self-medicated with alcohol for years, went through periods of homelessness, existed on the margins of society without understanding why he couldn't seem to function like other people. The breakthrough came during the psychiatric hospitalization in 2018, when he'd been admitted after a suicide attempt following years of mounting psychological distress. A therapist specializing in dissociative disorders named Dr. Rebecca Torres had been assigned to his case. She'd noticed inconsistencies in his history, gaps in his narrative that didn't align with typical memory patterns. When she'd asked him to describe his earliest memories, he'd become agitated and described scenes that didn't match the foster care story. She'd initially thought these were false memories, confabulations created by trauma. But the details were too specific, too consistent, too vivid. Dr. Torres had worked with him using careful techniques designed to access suppressed memories without creating false ones. And Kevin's own memories, once given permission to surface fully, proved reliable. He remembered the house with yellow siding. He remembered Linda's voice singing in the kitchen. He remembered Tom coming home from work smelling like sawdust. He remembered the blue sneakers with the white stripe that he'd loved so much. He remembered the morning of October 17th, remembered a woman approaching him at the bus stop, remembered her urgent voice saying his mother had been hurt. And then fragmented images. A car ride, a strange house, days of crying, being told over and over that his memories were wrong until they'd started to feel wrong, until he'd stopped trusting his own mind. School records were examined more carefully once the connection was made. The forgery in his documentation became apparent to investigators trained to spot it. Inconsistent dates, mismatched font styles, reference numbers that didn't correspond to actual schools. And Kevin's own memories, corroborated by the DNA match and the specific details only the real Kevin Fischer would know, proved reliable. The physical evidence of his childhood, the scar, the crooked tooth, even the pattern of a birthmark, all matched medical records from 1989. Diane Pritchard was located in Nevada, living under her maiden name in a trailer park outside of Reno. She was arrested without resistance and charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, fraud, and a catalogue of other crimes that had compounded over 29 years. During interviews with investigators, she showed little remorse, claiming she'd given Kevin a better life, that she'd rescued him from something, though she could never specify what. She spoke about him as if he was still a child, still Marcus, as if the decades hadn't passed and the truth hadn't been revealed. Psychological evaluation suggested she'd suffered from a delusional disorder compounded by personality pathology. Convinced she was meant to be a mother, willing to steal that role when biology didn't provide it. Roger, Diane's former partner who'd helped imprison Kevin in those early years, had died 6 years earlier from liver disease, escaping earthly justice. Investigators learned he'd been aware the kidnapping was planned, had helped secure the rental house, had participated in the psychological manipulation. But death had put him beyond the reach of consequences. The legal proceedings took months. Diane's public defender tried to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness, but the premeditation and sustained deception over decades undermined that defense. She was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for kidnapping across state lines, with additional state charges ensuring she'd likely die in custody. It brought no one satisfaction. Justice, Linda learned, doesn't heal what was taken. It only acknowledges the debt. No sentence could return 29 years. No punishment could undo the damage. For Kevin, reintegration was slow and complicated and non-linear. He had to learn who his parents were as adults, and they had to learn who their son had become without them. There were good days when conversation flowed and connections formed, when Linda would say something that sparked a memory, and Kevin would light up with recognition. And there were hard days when the gulf of lost time felt too vast to cross, when Kevin would retreat into silence, overwhelmed by the impossibility of bridging two lives that had run parallel for so long. Kevin struggled with guilt, irrational but powerful, that he'd forgotten them, that he'd lived a life while they'd grieved, that he'd believed the lies Diane had told. Linda and Tom struggled with rage at what had been stolen, with grief for the years they'd never get back, with the impossible mathematics of love. How could they love the 41-year-old man sitting across from them when the 12-year-old boy was the one they'd lost? But gradually, they learned that both could be true, that Kevin was both the child they'd lost and the man he'd become, that loving him meant accepting all of it. Therapy became the scaffolding that held everyone together. Kevin worked with specialists in trauma recovery, learning to integrate his fragmented identity, to hold both truths, that he was Kevin Fischer and that he'd survived as Marcus Webb, and neither invalidated the other. He learned that adaptation to trauma wasn't betrayal of his true self, it had been survival. Linda and Tom learned about ambiguous loss, the particular cruelty of losing someone who hadn't died, of grieving someone who was alive, of the complicated emotional work required to accept that recovery doesn't mean restoration, that you can't simply resume where you left off after 29 years. The blue sneakers with the white stripe sat on a shelf in Kevin's new apartment, a studio in Riverside, where he'd chosen to relocate to be near his parents. He couldn't wear them, of course. They were child-sized, made for feet that hadn't grown yet, a relic from another life. But they represented something crucial, proof that the past was real, that the boy he'd been had existed, that his parents' love had never wavered even when his memory had. Sometimes he'd hold them, feel the worn canvas and faded rubber, and let himself remember being 12 and thinking these were the coolest shoes in the world. The investigation into what had happened during those lost years continued for months. School photos from the districts where Kevin had been enrolled under a false identity were examined. Several teachers remembered him but recalled no signs of distress. He'd seemed like a quiet, withdrawn kid, which wasn't unusual for foster children from difficult backgrounds. One teacher, Mrs. Patricia Ramsey, who'd taught him 9th grade English, remembered that he'd written beautiful, sad poetry, but had always deflected when she'd tried to talk to him about it. She'd noted in her records that Marcus Webb seemed to carry a profound loneliness, but had attributed it to his supposed history in foster care rather than recognizing what it actually was. A stolen child, grieving for a family he couldn't consciously remember, but whose absence he felt in every moment. The photos themselves were chilling in their ordinariness. Kevin at 13 in a school cafeteria, sitting alone. Kevin at 15 in a class photo, positioned in the back row, his expression blank. Kevin at 17 at a school function, hovering at the edges. In each image, you could see the disconnection if you knew to look for it. The way he never quite engaged with the camera, the absence of genuine expression, the body language of someone who didn't feel they belonged anywhere. These were the photos that revealed the dark truth. Kevin had been hiding in plain sight for years, visible to hundreds of people who'd never known to look for him, protected only by the assumption that paperwork was accurate and that adults who claimed to be guardians were telling the truth. The system had failed to see what was hiding in plain sight. A stolen child, living under a constructed identity, protected only by bureaucratic laziness and the sheer audacity of Diane's deception. Social workers who'd managed Kevin's file after he entered foster care were questioned. Most had retired or moved on, but those who remembered Marcus Webb expressed horror at what they'd missed. One caseworker, Gerald Simmons, broke down during his interview with investigators, saying he'd met with Kevin dozens of times and never suspected anything because the boy had seemed too resigned, too accepting of his circumstances to be hiding a secret identity. In the aftermath of Kevin's case, Riverside Police Department revised its protocols for missing children cases, implementing more robust DNA collection procedures and cross-referencing requirements. They established partnerships with schools and social services to flag children entering systems without clear documentation chains. They created training programs teaching administrators to recognize signs of identity theft in vulnerable populations. Linda and Tom became advocates, speaking to law enforcement groups about the importance of never closing cases, of maintaining DNA databases, of recognizing that children who disappear don't always stay children. Sometimes they grow up stolen, their identities erased but never truly destroyed. Kevin started speaking too, carefully and with the support of his therapists, at conferences and events focused on missing persons and recovered survivors. He talked about the strange persistence of selfhood, how even when everything external told him he was Marcus Webb, something internal had always felt wrong, like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit. He talked about the moment memory returned, not as a flood, but as fragments assembling slowly, painfully, into a picture he finally recognized. He talked about grief for the life he'd missed, for the person he might have become if he'd been allowed to grow up as Kevin Fischer instead of surviving as Marcus Webb. 3 years after the reunion, Kevin testified before a state committee examining gaps in child welfare documentation systems. He brought the blue sneakers with him, held them up, and said something that later became widely quoted in advocacy circles. These belonged to a kid who loved science fiction and wanted to learn guitar. That kid didn't disappear. He was disappeared. There's a difference. One is a mystery, the other is a crime. Systems need to be built to recognize that difference, to protect children from being erased. New legislation followed, requiring DNA verification for children entering foster care without clear documentation chains, mandatory cross-checking against missing persons databases, improved training for caseworkers to recognize signs of identity theft and coercion in vulnerable populations. It wouldn't undo what happened to Kevin, but it might prevent the same thing from happening to someone else's son or daughter. Several other long-term missing persons cases were solved in the following years. Using the protocols developed in response to Kevin's case, children who'd been stolen and hidden under false identities found and returned to families who'd never stopped searching. On October the 17th, 2021, 32 years to the day after his disappearance, Kevin, Linda and Tom planted a tree in the park where Kevin used to play as a child. It was a Japanese maple, chosen because its leaves turned brilliant red in autumn like the plaid shirt Kevin had wanted to wear the day he was taken, because it would outlive them all, because it would stand as a marker not of absence, but of return, of survival, of the stubborn resilience of love across impossible distance. They didn't make speeches. They simply stood together, three people connected by blood and loss and the complicated work of rebuilding what had been destroyed, and watched the tree settle into soil that would hold it for generations. Kevin's story became part of a larger advocacy effort coordinated through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. His case was featured in training materials, emphasizing that recovery is possible even decades later, that DNA technology and database coordination save lives, that families should never be told to give up hope. The materials included practical information about maintaining biological samples, keeping cases active in databases, working with age progression specialists, utilizing media effectively without burning out from constant attention. Linda worked with legislators to improve funding for cold case investigations, testifying about the importance of dedicated resources for cases that had gone years without resolution. Tom volunteered with search and recovery organizations, using his construction skills to help build infrastructure for search efforts in difficult terrain. Observation platforms for dense forests, storage facilities for equipment, coordination centers for large-scale volunteer operations. But mostly, they lived small, ordinary lives, the kind of normal that had been stolen and that they consciously chose to rebuild. Kevin got a job as a library assistant, finding peace among books, including the Michael Crichton novels he'd loved as a kid. He completed his GED, then took community college courses, slowly building the education that had been disrupted. Linda returned to painting, a hobby she'd abandoned in 1989, filling canvases with color as a counterbalance to all those gray years. She painted landscapes mostly, scenes of places that existed only in imagination, worlds where children didn't vanish. Tom built things with his hands, birdhouses, shelves, a garden bed where they grew tomatoes and basil, creating objects that would last, that served purposes, that gave him a sense of control in a world that had proven chaotic. They learned to be a family again, not by pretending the intervening years hadn't happened, but by acknowledging them, carrying them, examining them with the help of professionals who understood trauma, and choosing connection anyway. Kevin would never get back his teenage years, his 20s, his 30s. Linda and Tom would never get to see him graduate middle school, learn to drive, fall in love for the first time, make the small mistakes, and achieve the small victories that comprise a normal adolescence and young adulthood. Those moments were simply gone, stolen by Diane Pritchard and impossible to recover. But there were new moments, built deliberately and with intention. Coffee on Sunday mornings where they'd read the newspaper together, slowly learning each other's rhythms. Phone calls that didn't carry desperation, just the simple desire to check in, to maintain connection. Holidays spent together where they created new traditions since the old ones were too painful to resurrect exactly as they'd been. Kevin's first Thanksgiving back, Linda made everything she remembered him liking as a child, but he'd spent 29 years developing different tastes, and they'd laughed together at the absurdity of it, at the impossibility of time standing still. The accumulation of ordinary time, which they'd learned was actually the most extraordinary thing of all. The privilege of boredom, of routine, of knowing where your family member is on a random Tuesday afternoon. Kevin started dating eventually, though relationships were complicated by his history. He had to explain to potential partners that he'd lived under a false identity for most of his life, that he'd been stolen as a child, that he carried trauma in ways that would occasionally surface. Some people couldn't handle the weight of that history, but eventually he met Sarah, a teacher who worked with at-risk youth and understood trauma responses, who had patience for his bad days and celebrated his good ones. They moved slowly, building trust incrementally, and eventually moved in together in a small house 2 blocks from Tom and Linda. The extended family gradually integrated Kevin back into gatherings. Cousins he barely remembered welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and compassion. His Aunt Deborah, Tom's sister, had kept every birthday card she'd written but never sent, 29 envelopes addressed to Kevin Fischer in care of his parents, marking his imagined growth. She gave them to him in a box, and he spent an evening reading them, following the arc of her life through the messages. Marriages, divorces, children born, parents lost, all addressed to a nephew who'd been frozen in time for her. If you know someone who's searching for a missing loved one, or if you're involved in advocacy for missing persons, remember that cases are only cold until they're not. DNA never forgets. Databases don't give up. Technology improves, creating new opportunities for matching and identification that didn't exist even a few years ago. And sometimes, decades later, blue sneakers with a white stripe become evidence not of loss, but of love that outlasted every impossible odd, of families that refused to give up, of systems that eventually, imperfectly, brought someone home. Kevin still struggles with the weight of his story. He attends therapy weekly, works through complicated feelings about identity and agency and the years that were taken. He has nightmares sometimes, wakes up not knowing which name is real, has to ground himself in the present. This apartment, this bed, this life that he's chosen. But he also has moments of profound gratitude, awareness that he survived something that destroys many people, that he made it back to a family that never stopped looking, that he has the chance to build a future when so many missing persons never get that opportunity. On the anniversary of his return, Kevin, Linda and Tom visit the Japanese maple they planted. They don't bring cameras or make it a production. They simply stand together under branches that grow a little fuller each year, leaves turning red as October deepens, and acknowledge everything that brought them to this moment. The horror and the hope, the loss and the recovery. The impossibility of time healing all wounds, but the possibility of learning to live with scars. The blue sneakers with the white stripe remain on Kevin's shelf, a reminder that some things endure, even when everything else changes, that love persists across decades and trauma and impossible circumstances, that a child's shoes can become a symbol of something larger than themselves, proof that people are worth searching for, that giving up is never the answer, and that sometimes, against all odds and reason, the lost do come home.